Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Um, so essentially, the coronavirus pandemic has impacted every aspect of consumers' lives. For today's discussion, what we will be doing is we will be using AI to understand how consumer behavior is really changing in China and how the COVID pandemic has affected food preferences as the Chinese consumer really copes with what is happening. Before we get started, a brief introduction about myself. Um, I'm the head of innovation and insights at AI-Palette, and I have a background in brand management across Asia and North America. The topics we will be covering today, we'll start with talking a little bit about the methodology that we have used to put this analysis together in collaboration with FIA. We'll talk about the key drivers and the motivations that are really driving the Chinese consumer. We'll also go into what are the product categories which are growing and declining. Then we look at how food consumption and demand patterns are really evolving and emerging in the Chinese market as the Chinese consumer copes with the COVID pandemic. And lastly, we'll dig into a regional analysis to figure out how essentially the different regions in China are reacting to this virus. Let me start by telling you a little bit about AI-Palette. So we are a Singapore-based startup that's backed by the government of Singapore. We work with consumer goods companies to use AI to help them identify and predict trends in real time. We also help our clients analyze the consumer needs that are really driving consumption patterns in a particular market. And we do this powered by our language agnostic AI algorithm, which is trained, first of all, specifically to understand different non-English languages, in this case, Mandarin. We also train our algorithm specifically on food and beverage related data because the context in which consumers talk about food tends to be very different from the way they would talk about anything else. To give you an example, when you use the word hot when it comes to food, it typically means rich in chili and very spicy. But when you use the word hot in any other context, it's typically referring to the temperature. So which is why we train our AI algorithm specifically on food and beverage related data. And all of this analysis is done in the local language, in this case, Mandarin. So for this study, we have analyzed a total of 339 million data points from the period of Jan of 2019 to March of 2020. We've used the 2019 data to help us establish a trend line and then dug deeper into the data for the past 3 months to help us see how consumer behavior is evolving. And to power our analysis, we've used the two most popular sources in China: the microblogging website Weibo and the most popular search engine Baidu. We define a data point essentially as any way in which a consumer engages with content. So it's not just mentions, it also covers aspects like the way consumers interact with content through likes, comments, shares, as well as search queries on Baidu. So with that, let me dig deeper into the findings that our AI algorithm helped analyze. So we'll start by looking at the key drivers and motivations which are really driving consumption in China. So right now, the key driver which is really inspiring and motivating the Chinese consumer is taste, where she's actively choosing taste over health. And this is attributed to a few different things. She's really relying on food as a way to make herself feel better about herself, as well as restore her sense of normalcy. So taste is currently the number one consumption driver, reflected in 32.81% of the consumer conversations that we analyzed, which translates to 101 million data points. And taste as a topic of conversation is actually at all-time highs. So it is essentially at the same levels that it tends to be at more indulgent times of the year, like November and December. So taste is really key and top of mind for the Chinese consumer. Health is, of course, at a close second. So as you can see from the graph below, health has the conversations around health and the consumer expressions which spoke about health really increased significantly, saw a significant increase in the month of January when the coronavirus pandemic broke out. And though, however, it has plateaued out and it's currently on the way down. So while it is a close number two as a consumption driver, it is currently, the consumer conversations have currently plateaued out around health. But health is a very broad topic. Let's double click and dig deeper into the different aspects of health that are driving the Chinese consumer. So when we analyze the data, what we saw is that health and immunity definitely saw a significant increase in conversation once the pandemic broke out in January. And while conversations for both health and immunity have plateaued out, the Chinese consumers' interest in preventive remedies still is very strong. As you can see from the graph at the bottom, where the consumer interest in prevention as a topic of conversation is still very strong. Let's dig deeper into looking at a few other aspects of health. So the Chinese consumer is really looking to get back into shape after the lockdown. And you can see this translate to conversations around diet, which are at an all-time high, reflected in 3 million data points in the graph here on top. And while there was some consumer interest in topics around energy and nutrition during the peak of the lockdown in the month of February, that excitement, that momentum has not sustained. So topics around energy and nutrition have seen a downtrend, but diet is definitely top of mind for the Chinese consumer, reflected in the data that we analyzed. Next, let's go into packaging as a driver. So what we have seen is that packaging, consumer interest in packaging is actually at an all-time high. Sorry, just give me a second. Packaging has emerged to be a very important driver during the coronavirus pandemic, and consumer interest in packaging is really at an all-time high, which is reflected in 19.66 million data points that we analyzed. And as you can see, packaging as a topic of conversation is not only at an all-time high, it actually increased significantly in the month of March, growing 162% versus the prior month. But the concerns that the Chinese consumer has around packaging is so much more than just stockpiling. What we saw when we analyzed the data is that the consumer discussions around packaging are really driven by three main aspects. Yes, the Chinese consumer is interested in prolonged storage, but at the same time, you can also see that she also has concerns around hygiene with aspects like of packaging, like individually wrapped, showing up in consumer conversations. And interestingly enough, when we looked at pack sizes, what we saw is that the consumer, since she has been stockpiling and since she has been essentially accumulating a lot of different produce, what we saw is that small packs were actually top of mind and more top of mind as compared to family size or value packs. This might be driven by the fact that in a city like Beijing, for instance, the apartments tend to be very small. So when she's stockpiling different items, there's only so much that she can, sort of accumulate and accommodate in her apartment. So which is why small packs are actually top of mind for the Chinese consumer. And you can definitely see a preference of plastic since it enables prolonged storage over paper. Next, let's get into distribution. So distribution has also emerged as a significant driver when we dug into the data over the past 3 months. And what we've seen is that overall, the sentiment, while the concerns around distribution have plateaued out and have sort of dropped over the time period of Jan 2020 to March 2020, there is still an overwhelming negative sentiment around distribution, where still 6.66% of the consumer conversations around distribution are negative. And we'll dig a little bit deeper into what those negative conversations are around. When we dug into distribution, what we saw is that the Chinese consumer is still very much relying on traditional offline channels. And that's primarily driven by frustrations over delays and in delivery from e-commerce. So you can really see that because of the delays in e-commerce, she is still very much relying on offline channels, whether that is supermarkets or convenience stores, to really meet her needs. Since now that we've gone over the drivers which are driving decisions, consumer decisions in China, let's now look at what are the product categories which are growing and declining. So firstly, there is a significant increase in consumer interest for fresh produce. And especially particularly vegetables like tomato, which are known to be very rich in vitamin C, have seen a significant increase. While at the same time, especially during the peak of the coronavirus pandemic, the Chinese consumer did rely on products which have a long shelf life to help get her through. So we did see an increase in products like rice, noodles, and instant food, as well as frozen food. The other product category that I want to highlight is essentially driven by how the Chinese consumer is really relying on trusted preventive measures like home remedies or traditional Chinese medicine to help her get through this virus. So we saw a significant increase in home remedies like garlic and other immunity boosting ingredients which the Chinese consumer relies on. We also saw an increase in some indulgences. So while the Chinese consumer is stuck at home during the peak of the lockdown, there was an increase in indulgences like chips and cakes, which again we'll go a little bit deeper into further along as the presentation progresses. And there was an increase in plant-based proteins like mushroom, which are already very popular. And while Impossible Foods did show a significant increase in the first 3 months of this year versus the first 3 months of last year, we'll actually dig a little bit deeper into how that trend unfolded to see what the impact really was. Now that we've seen the product categories which are increasing, let's look at some of the product categories which are on the decline. So as far as animal-based protein went, mutton and duck were two sources of animal protein which were hit by, which saw some amount of decrease in the consumer interest and consumer conversations. And that was primarily driven by frustrations around distribution, delay, or lack of stock. We did also see a decrease in product categories like burgers and carbonated drinks, which consumers typically consume in restaurants or other essentially when they socialize. So since social distancing measures were put into play, there was some decrease in product categories which consumers consume when they are socializing. And the other aspect that was hitting a product category like burger is that it's a high contact food. So essentially what that means is that there were some conversations which expressed a concern over hygiene. Now that we've seen the product and the declining, so the product categories which are growing and declining, let's look at the consumption demand patterns that are really unfolding in China. So firstly, let's look at something that's on everybody's mind, health and immunity. So health and immunity, yes, it did see a significant upsurge in the month of January. As you can see from the graph on top, both health and immunity did see a significant upsurge. But the conversations around health and immunity, as I was saying, have plateaued out. While the consumer interest in vitamin C still continues to remain strong, growing at 150% in March versus the prior month of February. These are some of the categories and ingredients which are closely associated with immunity in the consumer's minds. So essentially, categories like fruit teas and fruit juices are very closely associated with immunity. And another category which was also popular on e-commerce was fruit gummies and candy, typically typically consumed by children. So it's what parents are relying to help their children build their immunity. And when we looked at ingredients, again, here as well, we saw the Chinese consumer really relying on home remedies to help her get through the coronavirus pandemic. Next, let's look into the battle of frozen versus fresh and how that really played out during the COVID pandemic. What we saw is that while frozen food and food which is dry or has a long shelf life did see a sudden upsurge in the month of February, the battle has really been won by fresh food. So the consumer interest, the Chinese consumers' interest in fresh food still continues to be strong and is currently at all-time highs. The graph here shows the surge in consumer conversations for noodles. And the second graph here shows the increase in the surge in conversations for frozen food. But overall, the battle of fresh versus frozen has definitely been won by fresh food, and that's what the Chinese consumer is really relying on to help her get through this COVID pandemic. The next demand pattern that we want to highlight is how consumers are really choosing at-home indulgences in a way to not only make her feel better about herself, but also to restore her sense of normalcy. So what we saw is that when we looked at indulgent foods like ice cream, there is an upsurge in the consumer interest around ice cream. The other interesting thing that we want to highlight here is cafe products like milk tea, which consumers typically consume in milk tea cafes. So while she can no longer walk over to her local milk tea or bubble tea shop to get her milk tea fix, there is definitely an increased interest with Chinese consumers really craving these products and recreating these products in the comfort of their own home. And there was also an increase in conversation or consumer interest in baking, essentially driven by the fact that baking or baked goods are seen as comfort food. Next, digging a little bit deeper into protein and how the topic of protein really unfolded during the COVID pandemic in China. So what we saw is that essentially animal protein as a whole was mainly hit when China decided to shut down its wet markets. So there was definitely a drop in consumer conversations around plant protein like beef, seafood, and chicken, but that was primarily driven by consumer frustration with lack of availability or lack of distribution rather than safety concerns. And even though the traditionally popular sources of animal protein were hit with a lack of availability, Unfortunately, this did not translate to a significant spike in demand for popular plant protein sources. So essentially, plant protein sources like mushroom and soy continued to remain popular, um, but they did not see a significant upsurge or a spike in demand. When we look at the more at plant protein sources like Impossible Foods, what we saw is that while there was a spike in January, as you can see from the graph at the bottom, this spike was just 50% of its 2019 peak. So while there was some interest in plant protein sources like Impossible Foods, it was definitely not a significant spike, and the spike has not also been it has not been a maintained spike either. So plant protein sources did not really benefit significantly from animal proteins not being available. With that, let's get into the topic of how these trends really unfolded at a regional level to see if there were any regional differences in the country of China. So for this, we analyzed 4 different regions. We analyzed the area around Beijing, then the Yangtze River Delta around Shanghai. Then we also analyzed the Pearl River Delta around Guangdong, and lastly, the Chengdu Chongqing region. So what we saw here is that taste and health are really the top drivers which are driving consumption in all 4 of these regions. So taste and health are, as you can see, they are the top drivers in each and every one of these regions that we analyzed. While packaging and distribution was not really a concern in the political capital of Beijing, it is definitely a concern for the rest of China, where you can see a lot of consumer frustration around distribution and different aspects of packaging really driving consumer behavior. Now that we've seen the drivers and how they unfolded across these 4 regions, let's look at how the battle of canned versus fresh really unfolded across the regions as well. So for this, we'll highlight two main cities where the trend unfolded quite differently. So you can see the first 2 graphs reflecting how canned and fresh as a topic of consumer discussion played out in Beijing. And what we saw is that essentially in Beijing, the consumer demand, the consumer interest in fresh food is very strong, and it still continues to be strong. And canned food was not really something that people in Beijing really relied upon. But at the same time, the battle of canned versus fresh unfolded differently in Shanghai, where you can see that essentially because freshness of food was not really what was driving consumer conversations, but there was a significant spike in demand for canned food, as you can see in this graph here. So there was a significant increase in consumer conversations for canned food in Jan of 2020. So essentially, Beijing relied more on fresh food, while the people of Shanghai relied more on canned food. Next, you can see immunity. When you look at the topic of immunity, it saw a significant upsurge in all the 4 different regions that we analyzed. And while the immunity as a topic of consumer interest has dropped in, essentially in the region of Chongqing and Shanghai, it still continues to be very top of mind for the consumer in the markets of Beijing and Guangdong. So where consumers are still wary of the situation, so they're still very much concerned about immunity. And lastly, let's look at how the immunity boosting ingredients really played out across the different regions of China. And what we analyzed here was that there are more similarities than there are differences. So all across China, consumers are relying on home remedies like garlic and ginger, or trusted remedies like traditional Chinese medicine to help them get through this virus. There was some difference, however, in the popularity of vitamin C, where vitamin C tended to be more popular, a little bit more popular in tier 1 cities like Shanghai and Beijing, as compared to tier 2 cities, driven by more of an awareness of how vitamin C is associated with immunity in these in tier 1 cities as compared to tier 2 cities. So with that, we come to the end of the analysis that I've shared with you. I'll leave you with this parting thought. The trends and patterns emerging in China will definitely manifest differently across different markets in Asia as each country copes with the fallout of the COVID pandemic. So please join us for the remaining of our web series, where we will be talking about how the consumers in different markets in Asia are dealing with the pandemic. And absolutely feel free to reach out if you're interested in knowing how you can use AI to identify trends and changes in consumer behavior in the categories and markets that you're interested in. On the screen right now, I have my contact details, so you can reach out to me directly. With that, I will open the floor for questions.